Welcome to The Antidote. I'm Jeremy Rothkushel.
And this is Greg McCarran.
All right, so I'm doing the introduction today, and we have a lot to cover. We want to deal with, obviously, with the situation in relationship to Iran, the downed plane, the current domestic political situation, both in Iran and in the United States. And we want to put this all into context. And so I think what we do is start out with what was some of the domestic considerations in relationship to Donald Trump and his decision to assassinate General Soleimani. And then we will then move into what has happened in the last week and what it might mean about what is going on in relationship to the downing of the Ukrainian airliner in Iran and what the political situation in Iran is right now. And then maybe finally we will finish up by relating some of this to were there even maybe wag the dog kind of motivations of relation to why Donald Trump made this decision at this time, in terms of are there other things that are much closer to home about Donald Trump and his compromised background that might have been on the table that were coming up at almost the exact same time that this decision was made. Okay, so Greg, you any comments before we move into it?
No, let's get going. I think that this is, I think this may turn out to be one of our more interesting shows. We're going to definitely follow up on a very interesting, theory that you come up with. I think it's starting to gain a little bit of traction in certain areas of alt media regarding what may have happened with this Ukrainian airliner that was shot down. Iran has taken responsibility for it, called it an accident, and getting into that as well as some of the reactions that you've noticed as far as within various more in the pro-Russia type of milieu coming from various sources regarding this narrative and placements of possible blame. So I think this is going to be a very interesting programs. We're going to go, as you said, in about 3 different directions with this and hoping to tie it together. Specifics of what may or may not have happened, laying out a theory, laying out a bigger picture analysis of maybe some of the geopolitics, and then even what you talked about, the possible, wag the dog domestic scenario for possible reasons for all of the events, basically ranging all the way back from the killing of General Soleimani. So let's get into it.
Okay, let's get into it. And as we get into it, I want to put a reference to people to go look at the sites of people like John Swin, exposetheenemy.com, Jaleel Appleseed on YouTube, and then Brendan O'Connell's recent documentary video is very, very good. And so I believe that the information on those from those sources really gives a good amount of macro context to what's at the larger issues that we're facing here. And from a domestic perspective in relationship to the decision by Donald Trump to assassinate a recognized official of another government in the country. Last week we dealt with what a serious move that is in terms of the escalation of American lawlessness around the world. And then, of course, the questions of who's maybe more behind the scenes, which we're always asking in relationship to Donald Trump, who even in his presentation about Soleimani and why he murdered him, it was clear Donald Trump is on some kind of drugs. He's sniffing. You can go find videos of the amount of times he's sniffing. His eyes are all dilated. And so there is this background of Donald Trump being drugged up to some extent. And so people can go find that out. So that I'm just bringing that up to show that, that as we've talked about, Donald Trump is obviously he's his own man to some extent. He makes decisions, but he is a handled asset. and a lot goes into that, including the deeper financial background, which we'll get into later. But some of the most obvious things that would motivate Donald Trump to assassinate this leader is not national security or the alleged that there was an imminent threat, and that can all be seen now. They're just scrambling around. The Secretary of Defense Esper is saying he knows of no actual intelligence that there was a direct threat on 4 embassies, as Donald Trump said that he believed that there was. It's also clear that if there were actually actual threats, credible threats to American embassies, that it is American law to notify the embassy, the American public directly, actually, about the threats. And none of that has happened. Pompeo's doing his rigmarole too. So what was the real reason here, and what were some of the motivations of Donald Trump to do this? Obviously, and we'll return to this later in terms of a potential the wag the dog aspect of this, Donald Trump was facing imminent impeachment. And we've already dealt with a lot of the ways in which we see that the impeachment being headed by the Democrats is very much a limited hangout, which could be seen in many ways to have a lot to do with covering up the deeper criminality here, and very likely some of the deeper networks behind Trump, which very much trace back to the Israeli sphere. Okay, so the Democrats are fairly comfortable to deal with some of the Russian connections, even though that is also being hung out in a limited fashion. But the most difficult aspect that the Democrats are not willing to impeach on is this connection to the Israeli sphere and the intelligence services, that whole aspect in relationship to what we've talked about in terms of Arthur Finkelstein, Finky and the kids, and the actual political background and networks that link someone like Putin to Netanyahu via larger elements inside of the United States and even in Europe in terms of Orban. Okay, so, but at the same time, this is an actual political threat to Donald Trump, the impeachment as such. He is having to run defense for it, and so it's been reported that he was attempting to please some of his needed Republican senator allies in relationship to this murder of Soleimani.
Yes, that's an interesting point, because that would go into the type of people who maybe we've theorized are compromised perhaps by money coming through from the likes of Oleg Deripaska and or Len Blavatnik, such as Lindsey Graham and other senators. Maybe some of the Marco Rubio types could be shored up to be supportive of Trump, or even somewhere more in like the Bill Kristol type of neocon milieu, such as Senator Ben Sasse. I could see the support for people like that being shored up. But also at the same time, it's been thrown out that Trump could have done this to try and please John Bolton, if Bolton's indeed going to testify in the upcoming likely Senate impeachment trial. So,
yes, and I think that's the key other piece here is not just the senators, such as the people that supposedly knew about this operation before the rest of the U.S. Congress, who should have known potentially, other than arguments about Article 2 powers or what the use of military force reasoning was behind it. And Barbara Lee has done a lot to speak out about that. How is it that an administration in 2020 is using law from right after September 11th to justify assassinating an official of another government? So putting that aside, the other than the senators who were told, and it looks like it was basically Lindsey Graham and then the U.S. senator from Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, that were told.
Right. And if we're this is kind of a far out name to throw out there, but if we're to believe someone like Dr. Steve Pachenik on InfoWars, who clearly has had, deep state connections via Henry Kissinger and James Baker, among others, then he believes that, Vladimir Putin knew all about this and gave his stamp of approval for that. But, it's much more obvious of what Netanyahu, who obviously was in on the know about this, wanted to throw that out there. But Jeremy, we're missing the point here, because Trump has said himself that you can't let people like Adam Schiff know this information.
Right.
Because not only are we fighting the terrorists overseas, we're fighting the terrorists in the other party. So,
and of course, you can also see the political weapon of choice in terms of heading into an impeachment against a highly partisan, divided situation against the Democrats, to be able to paint them now as soft on the terrorists who were killing our troops over there, and who did 9/11, if you're to believe Pence and Pompeo.
Jeremy, that's very interesting. I want to throw this in there because you are getting that talk very much from the Lindsey Grahams, or the Congressman Dan Crenshaw's been at the forefront of a lot of pushing a lot of the propaganda talking points. The quote unquote war hero with the missing eye, and among other people. You're getting that perspective, but then on the flip side of that, you've also got the Tulsi Gabbards, who I think seem to be just as hawkish on the war on terror as an idea, but are instead pushing the somewhat conflicting narrative of that this took away from our efforts to go after our real enemy. So that's a very interesting dichotomy within two different elements of people of interest that are very much within like this pro-war on terror, the idea of fighting the war on terror in its most literal manifestation. So that's an interesting. But they all, even those analysis from the types like Tulsi Gabbard and Rand Paul, have their problems as well. But that's an interesting little variation of narratives.
Yeah, and it does, as we mentioned in the last radio show, there is a key piece of this that is about the persistence of the 9/11 lies and the propping up once again of the war on terror narrative, because even the criticism from, the so-called anti-war resistance, or the Democrats, like people like Tulsi Gabbard, but also like some of the more mainstream Democrats, is that, yes, Soleimani was on our side in terms of the war on terror against those actual terrorists that are actually organically driven out of the bowels of Salafist Islam, being backed by Saudi Arabia or something like that, in terms of
Don't forget the mother and father of ISIS, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton.
Yes, and so there is, then you have this perfect apparent split that props up the bigger key narrative, which has to do with the originating lies of September 11th and the war on terror as a construct that goes back, as we pointed out, before September 11th too.
Right, all the way back to 1979, and we could also pinpoint as well, and I need to actually do more on looking into the actual pinpointing just how significant the first Iraq War in 1991 was to this current modern day narrative. So it definitely goes back to before that, as well as not just September 11th. But I mean, I think certainly when we think about like the public justification that continues to be given for this perpetual state of warfare is September 11th, which of course none of these people are dealing with.
And as you pointed out, that this goes way back, even in relationship to Iraq, because it is key that the geography of this and the nationality of all this, right, is Iraq and Iran. And the Middle East post 9/11. And so the Gulf War in 91, in some way that was obvious, the launching of the actual overt war against Iraq that never stopped, including the escalation of the sanctions. Remember the infamous statement by under the Clinton administration in relationship to former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright being asked by Leslie Stahl, was it worth it, referring to the 500,000 deaths of Iraqi children in relationship to the Iraqi sanctions. And yes, it's a tough deal, but we think it was worth it, right? So that's obviously warfare of some sort. If you're killing hundreds of thousands of children, I mean, that's way beyond any kind of even hot war in terms of the death and destruction against innocents. So it's very obvious that this is ongoing. And so this is the latest stage of an ongoing war against the people in that region. So, but you pointed out, Greg, that in addition to the actual in-place politicians, elected politicians, the senators who Trump needs their support, such as people like maybe Marco Rubio, or as you pointed out, Ben Sass, who was always alleged to have been just a grain of sand away from tipping the scales to turning against Trump because he was disparaging the Republican Party. There is also the question of John Bolton. And John Bolton, obviously, the question of is he going to testify about what he termed the drug deal that was going down in relationship to Ukraine and Rudy Giuliani's obvious red mafia, Eurasian organized crime networks that were involved in what Bolton called the drug deal going down. And is Bolton going to blow the whistle on the drug deal in the upcoming trial in the Senate of Donald J. Trump? And so then meanwhile, bam, this goes off and Soleimani's murdered by Trump. And then here's John Bolton within the last 24 hours on Twitter saying the Khamenei regime has never been under more stress. Regime change is in the air. The people of Iran can see it. America, Europe, and France should not try to prop it up or negotiate with its illegitimate representatives, unquote. So that you can see exactly where John Bolton stands on the matter. And so maybe that's a good jumping off point to actually talk about what is happening in Iran right now and what happened late last week in terms of mid last week in terms of the shooting down of the Ukrainian airliner Ps752. And so, Greg, do you want to talk first about what's happening in Iran right now, or should I talk about what my hypothesis that I put forth is?
We could do it either way. I guess I could preface what we're about to talk about here that, excuse me, when you take into consideration I think the significance of this plane downing and Iran, taking responsibility for it, and it seems that, and this is not to say that this has not been in the making for a long time. The seeds have not been planted for a long time on this, because obviously there's been years of probably somewhat artificial, but clearly not entirely artificial uprisings and attempts at color revolutions in Iran going back to 2009 during the Obama administration, or back in the beginning of 2018. But it does seem that the combination of the assassination of Soleimani and the outpouring of grief and anger towards particularly, you could say, the U.S. and Israel from Iranians after this, and then this plane downing, which I think has been used. It appears this has been used by various interests, probably both domestic as well as foreign influence, as a catalyst for new mass protests in Iran. And so it does seem to me that this is, when you look at it from my personal perspective, that rather than any type of serious, like major Iraq-style military operation, as far as in an attempt to achieve some type of regime change in Iran, that it's been my belief there's going to be the more covert, subtle or covert forms of possibly achieving this goal through things like fomenting domestic chaos in Iran. And this type of event is, and I'm not saying this is the case because I don't know for sure, but just from looking at this, it seems to be a plane downing in Iran taking responsibility for it, at least publicly, does seem to be the perfect storm for these various, you can see various interests in Iran that are at odds with each other, as far as this appears to be, at least if you listen to the official narrative, student-based protesting of the Iranian regime, and this is proof that it can't be trusted, and the type of clashes it's creating with the with the pro Soleimani public, those who came out in mass numbers to grieve his killing, and so I think this might be, as the preface what we're about to get into, I think that this event has been a catalyst for whatever the next step is and whatever machinations and plottings going on with regards to whatever a possible means to create a means domestically in Iran to possibly fuel the climate for some type of regime change operation, maybe some type of removal of certain figures within the Iranian government, within the Iranian military establishment. And we'll have to wait and see on this, but I do think that this plane downing and what we're going to talk about here with this hypothesis theory that you're about to lay out, it does seem to be a perfect storm for a domestic operation within Iran. So let's get into it.
Well, thank you for that introduction, because I think it is key to consider the theater of war. And that means the actual physical theater of war in which we've seen the destruction of millions of lives in different contexts, and also the actual real threat of U.S. bombers and warplanes being moved into that quote-unquote theater of war in terms of Diego Garcia, lots of U.S. bomber activity moving in that direction. And so there is that the actual physicality, the threat of the theater of war is there. And yet at the same time, there's this ongoing question of the theatrics of war and how much of this is theatrical in relationship to a longer term kind of agreement or compromise that's bringing a lot of these players together in some way. And I mentioned to you, Greg, how there's some resonance that appears to me to be similar to the so-called response after September 11th that brought together different factions within, from an American perspective, from the American foreign policy quote-unquote elite, that would bring together the realists, so-called, such as the Brzezinski types, with the so-called neoconservatives. And we've talked about before, the Brzezinski is not a frontal Zionist. He's always talked more in relationship to a bipolar kind of world, in relationship against the Soviet Union, and how Southeast Asia was the key to the controlling of the grand chessboard. And then these so-called neoconservatives, all Zionists, some gradation in terms of whether they're Israel firsters or Israel seconders, really, and we won't go into all of that. But then post 9/11, the consensus and the mediation deal, I would call it in some way, was, let's take this to Afghanistan. This is where it's from the hills of Afghanistan where this was organized from, even though Osama bin Laden, I believe, he was all over the place, it looks like, but alleged to have said from the hills of Afghanistan that he did not do September 11th. And yet, bam, here we are even 20 years later almost, and with U.S. troops all throughout that region, definitely set up strongly in Afghanistan. And as we pointed out before, with the spike in opium production from that region going through the roof post 9/11. And so my sense is that that the Israel sort of centric neocons, they were much more interested, obviously, geopolitically, in Iraq, which is why that immediately followed. And that they also, in the run-up to the Iraq invasion of 2003, there was a lot of propaganda that involved September 11th. Remember all of that, the mushroom cloud, the question of I believe this was Israeli intelligence born, the question of Mohammed Atta in the Czech Republic meeting with Iraqi intelligence, right? So there was this Iraq 9/11 connection in a very similar way that we're seeing right now in terms of propaganda effect from the Mike Pences and the Pompeos and those kind of guys about the Iran 9/11 connection. Okay. So I just bring all that up to show that there was some kind of there was an agreement of some sort about from different factions who had different geopolitical immediate interests in mind to go to Afghanistan. And so it's very possible that in the midst of this, there is some kind of mediation or moderation or some type of agreement in relationship to where does Iran go from here in a way where maybe the more aggressive warmongers might give in, and then the more Obama faction who actually wanted to bring Iran back into the neoliberal world order economically are also not going to disagree with it as long as there is no hot war escalation.
Yeah, and that's and following up on that, we got to, you talked about this compromising and this coming together in agreement through varying factions who did not have the same goals in mind. You saw a commonality of running cover for each other, like none of these various sides, the Brzezinski side or the PNAC neocon side, ever really effectively exposed each other in any major way. I mean, there was obviously a major, at least public split over something like the Iraq War, but it was something where all of these various players had interests that were at stake, as far as all having a vested interest in taking advantage of something like September 11th, because everybody points to PNAC and the idea of the catalyzing event such as a Pearl Harbor style event to justify this remaking of the Middle East. But you also got to remember Brzezinski in his book The Grand Chessboard had laid out how there could be a similar type of scenario to establish Eurasian dominance in a very similar light. So, and that's, I think, when you think of this compromise or this bargain of some type coming together, I just want to lay out real quick that it seems to me there's three specific interests that are at play here, and I might not be taking everything into consideration. Certainly, there's a China factor that I need to really continue to really look more into. But with regards to what I see as the players going on, you have the U.S. neoliberal foreign policy consensus, which was about in the Obama administration about bringing the West to Iran. It seems to me like, and all of the good and bad and ugly of Western culture and what that entails, but bringing Iran into like a U.S. European dominated, Western dominated world order. And then you have this Israeli faction, which does seem to be very hawkish and all about regime change in Iran, although there's questions about just the actual nature of the Israeli-Iranian relationship from a historical perspective. Is Iran serving the role of a boogeyman, or is it something completely different, or is it a combination of things? And then you've got this very multipolar Russian milieu that does have influence around Trump. I would say through things such as the Center for the National Interest, and obviously through a lot of alternative media that is pushing for, it seems, for Iran to be integrated into a world order that is dominated by the East, particularly by Russia and China, with Israel at the center of it. And I would say that even in the case of the Trump administration, that the latter two interests, I think, line up a lot more with each other from a global geopolitical perspective. This Israeli-centric and Russian multipolar-centric interests line up, I think, and both of those are in direct contrast, it seems, from the U.S. Foreign policy consensus view on something like Iran. So in that regard, and that's why I think these strange bedfellows within the Trump administration, within the Trump bigger picture going on with the Trump administration, work well together, despite there being some tension when it comes to possible differences in how to handle something like Iran. But when it comes to geopolitics globally, I think these two factions are pretty much in line on a lot of issues. But these are the kind of the factions I see at play here, and what kind of possible compromise or bargaining will be brought together between these factions. It's going to be interesting to see it play out. And so that's just my perspective on what appears to be the varying players that might have interests at stake in all of this.
All right. Well, thank you for laying that out, Greg.
I guess we should get into, do you want to get into this, what you wrote that was published on Veterans Today regarding this downing of this plane?
Yes. So after we recorded our last radio show last week, the Iranians responded, right? This was after we'd recorded last week. The Iranians responded to the Soleimani assassination by firing over 10 missiles into a U.S. base in Iraq, I think in Erbil, I think is where it was. and the Iranians apparently gave warning to the Iraqi officials, who then passed it on to the Americans. And it's reported that there were no casualties because everybody had time to get out of the way. But the Iranians showed their missiles to be highly effective and very accurate. And so it showed that they had the ability to deploy force in the region in a highly targeted fashion. So it was, in military terms, a very effective response. And then they're not pursuing massive casualties or casualties at all, it appears like, in terms of the American soldiers, was very wise in terms of not giving the U.S. any reason to further escalate, while also responding both in terms of a military response and also for the domestic consumption, in terms of saying, I believe the terminology was, we gave the U.S. a slap or something in the face or something like that. So then in the immediate wake of that, hours after, there were some weird things going on that included an earthquake that popped up in Iran right around one of their deep underground military facilities. But then the thing that really was front and center was this Ukrainian origin Boeing 737, I believe, Ps752 that was it was originally reported as it crashed and everybody died, and it was a lot of basically a large portion of Iranian nationals. Some were maybe dual nationals. There were people from Ukraine. There was a lot of Canadians and Iranian students and PhD and engineers from there. There was other people from other parts of Europe, I believe, and so immediately there were questions about how this had happened, and then I began to look into it, and the timing of it seemed very suspicious to me, especially in the wake of the Iranian response. It did seem, yes, okay, everything's really tense right now and things can happen in a war zone. So it seemed like, okay, it's very possible that this could have been rather than some kind of sabotage either on board the plane with the electronics or in the missile system, this could have been a mistake by Iranian forces. I mean, there's other people were putting forth even theories that the Iranians did this on purpose because they were trying to take down some kind of rat nest of spies that were trying to escape, or there's all kinds of theories like that were being put forth. But I just kept my eye on it, and then I believe it was on Thursday night, I was listening to KPFK radio, which is the Pacifica affiliate in Los Angeles, and to the Ian Masters radio show there, which is the sort of the go-to on the West Coast of like the top shelf intelligence hangout for the Hollywood set, really, is in many ways the way you could describe it. And he had on a man, his name is David Paul Gleave. He's at Plane Crash Guy on Twitter, and he describes himself as an aviation safety investigator, risk manager, and PhD student. And he's usually close to an airport. That's his location on Twitter. And so he was describing how it looked to him at that point that it was a missile shoot down, and that he believed that if it turned out to be a missile shoot down by the Iranians, that it would be likely due to something like automation or a software error, not a human one. And at that point, things clicked in my mind, because before that moment, I couldn't quite piece together what was going on here. It felt really suspicious. And so then at that point, I wrote up an analysis of it and sent it out as an email to the False Flag Weekly News email group. And so I'm just going to read that. And then this was eventually then published the next day by Kevin Barrett on the thread on Veterans Today, where he published that week's False Flag Weekly News that he did with Ian Greenhall. Okay, so the way that Kevin Barrett titled it is, quote, "The prime suspect in Ukrainian Ps752 shoot down Israel's Unit 8200 by Jeremy Rothkushel." And that was not my title, but the writing after this is what I said. So, quote, "Just a couple hours ago, I heard on the radio an air traffic controller expert who had fairly recently worked in and with Iran saying that he thought it was very possible that the airline downing, if it were a shoot down as it looks like it was to him, would be due to a, quote, automation or, quote unquote, software error, not a human one. And it clicked for me. This was an Israeli cyber terrorist attack that triggered Russian-made Iranian anti-aircraft missile systems to misfire against a friendly civilian target by a Unit 8200 backdoor into the, quote, friend or foe, unquote, ID code conduited to Israel via Russian technology relations." Okay, and aside here, I just want to remind everybody that this is my hypothesis. This is the hypothesis, the analytical hypothesis that I put forward as a basis for the way that I was looking at what might have happened here. And I would just remind, myself and everybody else that this is the way that real epistemology is done, both in terms of the more maybe humanities aspects like journalism or history, but then also in relationship to the scientific method, the hypothesis. And the hypothesis can come from a different array of possibilities. It could come in a heavily factual way where the facts begin to array so heavily that it becomes the picture of how they all fit together becomes obvious. Other times it's maybe a combination of some aspect of a factual array, some piece of missing information or what people are not saying or what's not been dealt with yet, and then an analytical a gut instinct or a sense of what the negative space might hold. Okay, so I'm just describing the way that I perceive this kind of process as unfolding, and that I'm not attached to this as the quote unquote truth. This was a hypothesis that I put forward to be tested by public analysis of the facts that were known, and then the facts that could be then discovered. Okay, so back to the text. Quote, "The Iranians accused Russia years ago of single quote selling the single quote codes to Iran's Russian-supplied anti-aircraft tech to Israel. And it was said that the compromise of the supplied single quote codes would follow, quote, faux Israeli fighters to confuse Iranian anti-aircraft, quote, friend or foe ID systems to slip through Iranian airspace as, quote, friends. But, of course, the penetrated, quote, friend or foe, unquote, ID system could be flipped the other way, turning a quote-unquote friendly Ukrainian passenger airliner that just took off into a quote-unquote foe to be shot down, and the system would automate its cyber false-flagged response before human intervention would be feasible, and it could all be tagged to single-quote human error. Now, the Iranians likely would have made some moves in regards to systems they believed compromised, but the word is, in this case, from sources in the Israeli press, is that it was Russian-made Tor M1 missiles that likely took down the plane. And then included a Times of Israel story titled "Iranian Missile Likely Downed Ukrainian Flight Near Tehran," U.S. officials say. And I also want to say I didn't include links to the backing the previous publications about these claims about the Iranians accusing the Russians of sharing the codes with Israel, but I will include in the links lots of different aspects and approaches to that, which includes things like there was a WikiLeaks leak of a Stratfor document that said that from an alleged intelligence source in Mexico had said that there was a trade-off between Russia and Israel directly in terms of Russia's interest in Israeli-supplied UAV to Georgia, I believe, at the time, and then the Israelis received what was said to have been the codes to the Russian-supplied, I think they were, at that point, they were referring to the Tor M1 systems, but it might have been one of the S200 or 300 systems. But there's also, I've included Veterans Today links by Gordon Duff, who calls into question that, including Jerusalem Post and WikiLeaks, as potentially just sort of pure Israeli black propaganda to try to create a division between a suspicion between Iran and Russia. But I think that that's a simplistic understanding of it, and that there is very likely, even if it's propaganda, which obviously the Jerusalem Post is Israeli, there's a strong Israeli intelligence component. It could be just like much propaganda, including grave propaganda. There could be a lot of truth to it. And you can imagine that the Israelis do like their quote unquote enemies to know some of their capacity. And I would then also say that there's a possibility too that the limited hangout aspect of it has to do with that this is very likely that the Israelis not only have the potential to quote unquote hack or backdoor or penetrate Russian supplied Iranian systems such as the Tor M1 anti-aircraft missile systems, but the Israelis also have aggressive offensive electronic warfare capacities that they built into, it looks like, into their F-35 fighter planes via something like what's called, it's a BAE Systems program called Suitor, and we'll include the links to an analysis of that. And so I think that also could be playing into this, an analysis of this Iran situation too. Okay, and a lot of the links too will refer to what happened in Syria in relationship to the Israelis, the Russians, the Iranians, the Americans, and all of that complicated geostrategic and military analysis is in the mix here too. Okay, back to what I was writing on Thursday evening. Okay. Quote, and chipsets in general, including swaths of military cyber architecture, are largely compromised worldwide. Everybody knows this with U.S. technology and backdoors and limits designed into U.S.-supplied military ballistic hardware. This is likely why Russia and China are now attempting to build national security digital infrastructures that are totally indigenous. But countries like Iran and the U.S. are meanwhile very vulnerable to Israeli tech penetration. I think in an Israeli context, it was actually about a combination of deterrence, i.e., don't you dare think about launching thousands of missiles at Israeli cities in aggressive response and or have Hezbollah do that, and further demonization and discrediting of Iran internationally. As opposed to Stuxnet, which was U.S.-Israeli joint covert cyber action with the Israelis upping the ante on aggressiveness and virality, this was likely a unilateral Israeli covert cyber action using its technological relationship via Russia as the conduit and the USIC, the U.S. intelligence community, as the intel framer/confirmer of Iranian single quote culpability. The false flag theory limited hangout will likely be that this was an MEK operation and or mole in place. This is likely much worse than that in its global cyber implications for Iran and beyond. Watch for a Russian lead on the disinformation/cover-up front of the technicals, while the Israelis covertly single quotes brag on the facts to fully air out their act and have it be known by those who they want to know of their willingness to use their cyber power and terroristic ruthlessness. Iran's finicky and all-over-the-place response makes me think that this alleged covert terrorist show of Israeli cyber force is exactly what happened. They are likely between a rock and a hard place. They would have to admit single-quote culpability while also advancing facts that might publicly disclose that the Israelis, likely via a Russian technological conduit, might have a massive deterrent and worse, admit a likely compromise Iran to aggressive air attacks. But if this is true, the Iranians also have the material to end this whole thing with the truth internationally. Zarif has already expressed on Twitter that he knows that the truth is what the Trump administration is worried about and the reason he's being kept out of the U.S. from the UN. Even compromised U.S. Congress critters like Rand Paul and Mike Lee know that there is something deeply wrong about the Trump regime's story on single quotes intel. Forget the threats of regional proxy military hits and responses. That plays right into Zionist hands, both U.S. and single quotes multipolar. Expose Israel cyber deception via Russian conduited technology with U.S. intelligence framing the matter. The world is sympathetic to the Iranian position right now, in a resonant but altered way to the world's stance towards the U.S. on 9/11, during which we in the U.S. didn't fail to seize our Zionist-goaded moment to drive the world tractor of good faith right into our own manure pit of Zionist and MIC, military-industrial complex, treachery for 2 decades, while destroying millions of lives and further poisoning Muslim lands. The world is ready to forgive an Iranian mistake, even if its single-quote mistake killed almost 200 people. They did their missile military response flawlessly, showed their strategic effectiveness, restraint, and wisdom, while displaying massive aggressive deterrence towards Israel and U.S., SA, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, United Arab Emirates. But if this is an Israeli cyber attack against a civilian target, i.e. cyber false flag terrorism, and it is exposed as such, this could both put an immediate end to this clear and present aggression while showing the entire world the danger of Israeli cyber technology domination. And that's the end of the original analysis that I put forth that then got put up on Veterans Day on Friday.
Well, thank you for breaking that down, Jeremy. And this, as you said, this is just hypothesis. This is, as you said, putting a hypothesis and a theory in action. This is, this is what this is the scientific method. This is, I believe, what we're supposed to do, and in trying to do this in as responsible and as rational a manner as possible. And I certainly think that this is definitely worth being thrown out there as a possible explanation for what's going on here. I think we're trying to take a number of different factors into consideration, not just the obvious U.S. Israeli aggression against Iran, but also bringing in this still kind of almost the fifth column within the alternative media, so to speak, and that is the Israel-Russia relationship and how various sides, as we were talking about earlier, with these varying interests might benefit from seeing some type of domestic strife in Iran for varying geopolitical reasons. So that's got to be taken into consideration when we're analyzing something like this, as well as that. So I'm glad you came up with this, and we're putting this out there publicly as something for people to consider, taking a number of different interests into consideration and basing it on evidence of articles that have come out about these allegations of Israel or of Russia giving this information to Israel and giving these. And so it's definitely I think that you've done a good job with really trying to put this together in a sensible and logical manner. And as you alluded to earlier, there have been some other people who have had some very interesting takes that might be inspired by your analysis on this. And so do you want to get into some of those? You talked about the possibility of various people within this Russian milieu perhaps leading the way on putting out opposing information on this downing of this plane, perhaps in a more just generic blame the U.S. centric direction. So do you want to get into some of that?
Yes, and I would just point out that I think that there was like a handful of people, and probably more, but a handful of people who actually began to publicly articulate these kinds of questions at about the same time, because the situation appears to lend itself towards that kind of analysis, I would point out. And so that's what's interesting is there's really an interesting sort of variety of people who begin to pick up on some of these threads, I think, from their own perspectives, such as, I forget on Twitter, Gumby, something Gumby. I saw from him aspects of this question of Suitor, and that's the offensive electronic warfare, program that the United States has, and the Israelis apparently have some kind of version of it. And so there are and were people who were considering these kinds of angles. And I guess where I put myself on a ledge was by the hypothesis of who did it and why. Okay. And like I said, and like you just said too, it's still just a hypothesis, and it needs to be analyzed. And if it's wrong, it's wrong. It may be wrong, but it may be correct too. And it does explain some things about why certain parties are acting as they are. And that's why I put some of these things to look for, such as a question about watch for Russian lead on disinformation about the technicals, right? While I said that the Israelis would air out their act in a covert fashion to those who they wanted to know. And in the wake of this, it is very interesting what's then happened, because I believe it was the very next day after this was published, meanwhile, that whole day there was lots of, pushing back against the question of whether this was a missile. I'll include a Press TV interview of Scott Bennett. And I would point out there's definitely a heavy association of a specific alternative media sphere that's very Russian-centered. And then in terms of an Iranian context, it definitely hovers around what we've talked about, the New Horizon Conference, this question of Dugan, and what's being accomplished in relationship to that. So that is definitely a heavy weight here, I would say, of gravity in terms of that aspect of it. But then the IRGC, the commander of the Aerospace Force of the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps, a man named Amir Ali Hajizadeh, in the next day in a press conference outlined the details of, quote, an unintentional downing of the Ukrainian passenger plane which crashed in Tehran Wednesday. And I'll link to this. This is I believe it's a total English translation transcript of what Hajizadeh said. And so then the headlines of the very next day were, quote unquote, human error, right? And so this is what I had said would be, if this were the hypothesis about why it couldn't be talked about, it would be brought up as, quote unquote, human error. And I would also point out that there is also suggestion of, in relationship to last week's show, about there might be domestic factional, even warfare going on in relationship to Iran, and even in relationship to what might have been seen as the liquidation of a Soleimani, who could have been a stumbling block to the further integration of Iran into this multipolar imperial world order that was being greased in many ways by the Iran deal in certain ways. So this is not quite a disruption. It almost could be a catalyst of some sort in the background working here. So, but that should have, some people believe, okay, this is, the Iranians have admitted they made a mistake. And this should settle the whole thing. It was an Iranian mistake. They need to be held accountable for how this went wrong, and almost 200 innocent civilians were killed, but the question has been answered. But in the midst of that, Hajizadeh, the air commander of the IRGC, brought up three things that I noted, and I wrote this on Saturday, I believe, to the list that needed to be looked at. One, the question was, he said that the IRGC had requested a no-fly zone to be implemented, at the very least in this area, and that it had been rejected. And that, of course, is a very glaring global question about that is sort of front and center in terms of what some people say is evidence of Iranian culpability, is why did they allow these civilian flights to be flying around when their air defense stances were at the highest alert levels, were on sort of a trigger hair alert systems. The U.S. is posed in an aggressive stance towards Iran at that time. So that was an interesting question, and there still is only speculation, it looks like, about that. And then secondly, he said that the Tor M1 operative, Iranian operative, manning this is a mobile system. It's a Tor M1, and I will include a link to a YouTube channel that does a very good breakdown of it, of the system. It's also known in NATO circles as SA-15. But it is one of the specific systems that was said that Russia had given, quote, the codes to Israel. And it's isolated in terms of communications, which plays into the last piece that was questionable about what Hajizadeh said. Not questionable, but it raised questions about the reasoning for it. So second thing that was raised was he said that the operative on the ground at the Tor M1 system had said that it was identified that there was a cruise missile, that the flight had been identified as a cruise missile coming towards it. Okay, and so that raised a lot of questions too that have not really been answered, even by those who are trying to, such as Moon of Alabama and the Saker, I might point out, who are trying to say that the fog of war and human error is the most likely scenario here. The question is, there was lots of other flights. There was I think at least 10 other flights between that evening that left in the same direction from the Tehran airport, moving in the same direction at the same speed, and the system didn't light them up. So why was this different, right? Okay, so that was a question, and that was, of course, central to my hypothesis, was that you would see this as the system would paint a friendly civilian airliner as a foe, i.e. a cruise missile, okay? And then thirdly, he said that the operator was, because he's in an isolated mobile system, he's trying to get a communications contact to the wider Iranian fixed installation radar system to double check it. And the way Hajizadeh said it, there were quote unquote problems with the communications lines at that time, which points to some kind of either fog of war. There's a sort of a glut of domestic signals, but more likely something like electronic warfare and jamming, which would be expected in that moment, right? Okay, so those are the questions. So I would we'll link a lot. We're running out of time here, but we'll link to a lot of the different interpretations, including on Twitter. There is a Twitter account in Farsi that says an analysis that they say is coming from an Iranian counterterrorism unit that points in this direction and says that it is the hypothesis of this Iranian counterterrorism unit that happened. So I guess until next week, we'll have to leave it there. But there's so much more to unpack, Greg, and I appreciate your working with me on this.
Yes, and likewise, same goes to you.
All right. Bye, everybody.